The ragged woman pressed against the alley wall whispered urgently, "Don't talk, just listen." Officer Sarah Blake froze mid-step, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon as she studied the homeless figure before her. Celia Ghost Fuentes had spent months invisible in Misty Hollow's forgotten corners, but tonight she couldn't stay silent. Her loyal dog Rusty growled low, sensing the danger lurking in the shadows behind the unsuspecting cop. What Sarah didn't know was that the corruption she'd been investigating ran deeper than imagined, and Chief Morrison had just ordered her elimination. In this moment, two women from opposite worlds would collide, and Celia's military instincts screamed that breaking her golden rule of invisibility was the only way to save them both. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rain dripped steadily from the cracked gutters above, creating a symphony of metallic pings against the dumpsters lining the narrow alley behind Murphy's Diner. The smell of grease and rotting food mixed with the earthy scent of wet concrete, while distant streetlights cast long shadows that danced with each falling droplet. Celia's weathered military jacket hung loose on her thin frame, the fabric dark with moisture and worn thin at the elbows. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray, was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found 3 weeks ago. Beside her, Rusty's amber eyes remained fixed on something beyond Sarah's line of sight, his hackles raised in warning. Sarah's radio crackled with static before dispatcher Carol Martinez's voice cut through the night air. "Unit 7, what's your status on the welfare check at Murphy's?" Sarah's thumb hovered over the radio clipped to her shoulder, but Celia's urgent gesture stopped her. The homeless woman shook her head slowly, her weathered face etched with fear and determination. Through years of living on the streets, Celia had learned to read danger like others read newspapers. Every instinct she'd honed during 2 tours in Afghanistan was screaming now. "Behind the dumpster," Celia whispered, barely audible above the rain. "Armed. Been waiting since you pulled up." Sarah's pulse quickened as she processed the information. She'd been a cop in Misty Hollow for 3 years, long enough to know that most homeless folks avoided police contact entirely. For one to approach her with a warning meant the threat was real. Her training kicked in as she scanned the alley without making obvious movements, using her peripheral vision to assess potential cover points. Rusty's low growl deepened, and Sarah noticed how the dog's attention remained laser-focused on the shadows behind the large green dumpster positioned near the alley's dead end. The German Shepherd mix had scars across his muzzle and a slight limp in his left hind leg, battle wounds from a life on the streets. But his alertness was unmistakable. "How do you know?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely carrying over the rain. Celia's eyes flicked toward the main street where Sarah's patrol car sat under the lone functioning streetlight. Steam rose from the hood, and the headlights cut through the misty evening air. She'd watched Sarah park there 20 minutes ago, watched her walk toward the diner's back entrance to check on the reported disturbance. She'd also watched Detective Marcus Kane slip into the alley from the opposite end, positioning himself behind cover with something dark in his hand. "Military training," Celia replied simply, "movement patterns. He's not homeless, not drunk, not lost, he's hunting." The words hit Sarah like ice water. She'd been investigating discrepancies in evidence reports for weeks, following a trail that led uncomfortably close to her own department. Tonight's welfare check had been routine, or so she'd thought. Mrs. Fleming had called about suspicious activity behind her diner, but when Sarah arrived, the elderly woman claimed she hadn't made any such call. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If someone had lured her here deliberately, if this was connected to her investigation, then Detective Kane's presence wasn't coincidental. She thought about the files she'd been studying, the pattern of missing evidence in drug cases, the way certain arrests never seemed to stick. Chief Morrison's dismissive responses to her concerns suddenly took on a darker meaning. "Stay low," Sarah whispered to Celia. "When I move, you disappear." But Celia shook her head firmly. "Won't work. He's got backup. 2 more in the cruiser down the block, radio discipline maintained." Her voice carried the clipped certainty of someone who'd coordinated military operations. "They box you in, make it look like a confrontation gone wrong." Sarah felt her stomach drop. 3 officers, coordinated positioning, radio silence. This wasn't a random threat, it was an execution. Her investigation had uncovered something big enough to kill for, and she'd walked directly into the trap. Rusty suddenly shifted position, his attention moving from the dumpster to the mouth of the alley. Celia followed his gaze and cursed under her breath. Officer Mike Hendricks was approaching on foot, his hand resting casually on his weapon. His usual friendly demeanor was nowhere to be seen. "Time's up," Celia muttered. Sarah's radio crackled again. "Unit 7, respond to status check." This time, Sarah knew better than to answer. Carol Martinez had been dispatcher for 15 years. A by-the-book professional who never repeated status requests without good reason. If they wanted her location confirmed, it meant the trap was about to close. Celia pulled something from her jacket pocket, a small piece of broken mirror she used for signaling. She angled it to catch the streetlight, flashing a brief reflection toward the main road. Within seconds, a car alarm began wailing 3 blocks away, drawing attention and providing audio cover. "Smart," Sarah admitted. "Misdirection," Celia explained. "Learned it in Kandahar. Sometimes the best weapon is confusion." Detective Kane must have heard the alarm too, because his silhouette shifted behind the dumpster. Sarah caught the movement in her peripheral vision and knew their window was closing fast. The detective would emerge soon, confident that his backup was in position. "There's a storm drain," Celia said, pointing to a metal grate partially hidden by debris. "Leads to the creek, but it's tight." Sarah looked at the narrow opening, then back at Celia and Rusty. The homeless woman was offering her an escape route, but taking it would mean leaving Celia behind to face whatever consequences came next. Every instinct Sarah had developed as a police officer rebelled against abandoning a civilian who'd risked her own safety to provide warning. "Come with me," Sarah said. Celia's weathered face showed surprise, as if the concept of inclusion was foreign to her. For 18 months, she'd survived by remaining invisible, by never getting involved, by accepting that society had written her off. The invitation to matter, to be saved rather than just saving, caught her completely off guard. "They'll hunt you either way," Celia said finally. "Better if I'm not slowing you down." "Better if we stick together," Sarah countered. "You know things I need to know." Rusty's ears perked up as new sounds filtered through the rain. Footsteps on wet pavement, multiple sets, coordinated timing. The net was tightening. Celia made her decision. She grabbed the storm drain grate and pulled with strength that surprised Sarah. The metal gave way with a grinding screech that mixed with the still wailing car alarm. The opening was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and it led into absolute darkness. "You first," Celia insisted. "I'll follow with Rusty." Sarah hesitated for one crucial second, then dropped to her knees and squeezed through the opening. The storm drain was exactly as tight as Celia had warned, forcing her to crawl on her elbows through standing water and debris. Behind her, she heard Celia's urgent whisper, "Go, go, go!" The sound of Rusty scrambling through the opening was followed by Celia's heavier breathing as she pulled herself into the drain. Above them, shouts erupted as Detective Kane discovered their escape route. Flashlight beams swept across the alley, but they were already beyond reach. In the darkness of the storm drain, as they crawled toward an uncertain destination, Sarah realized her life had just changed forever. The investigation she'd been conducting was no longer academic. It was a matter of survival. And the homeless woman who'd saved her life was now her only ally, in a fight she was just beginning to understand. Water soaked through their clothes as they moved through the drainage system, guided by Rusty's instincts and Celia's military navigation skills. Behind them, radio chatter echoed off the concrete walls as their pursuers coordinated a search. Ahead lay the creek, and beyond that, the dark hills surrounding Misty Hollow where a ghost could disappear completely. But this time, Celia wouldn't be disappearing alone. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The storm drain opened into Copper Creek with a splash that echoed off the concrete culvert. Sarah emerged first, gasping as cold mountain water hit her chest, followed by Rusty, who shook himself vigorously despite still being submerged to his shoulders. Celia pulled herself out last, moving with practiced efficiency as she scanned their surroundings for immediate threats. The creek ran high from recent rains, carrying branches and debris downstream toward the Susquehanna River 20 miles south. On either side, dense woods stretched up the hillsides, offering cover but also concealing potential dangers. The only sounds were rushing water and the distant wail of sirens converging on the alley they'd just escaped. "This way," Celia said, leading them upstream against the current. Her knowledge of the terrain was immediate and confident, born from months of moving unseen through Misty Hollow's forgotten spaces. She knew which banks offered solid footing, which overhangs provided shelter, and most importantly, which routes kept them invisible from the roads above. Sarah struggled to match Celia's pace through the rocky stream. Her police boots weren't designed for creek walking, and the weight of her duty belt made balance treacherous on slippery stones. But she pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that Detective Kane and his backup were likely coordinating a manhunt at this very moment. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the rushing water. "Somewhere they won't look," Celia replied. "Old railroad bridge, half a mile upstream. Abandoned since the coal mines closed." As they moved, Sarah's mind churned through the implications of what had just happened. 3 fellow officers had set up an ambush specifically designed to kill her. The realization that corruption in the Misty Hollow Police Department ran far deeper than missing evidence reports was both terrifying and clarifying. She thought about the files locked in her personal safe at home, documentation of 17 separate cases where drug evidence had mysteriously disappeared or been contaminated. The creek made a sharp bend around a massive oak tree whose roots had been exposed by decades of erosion. Celia paused here, listening intently to sounds carried on the night air. Helicopter rotors thumped somewhere to the south, likely brought in from the county sheriff's department. Flashlight beams swept through the trees on the eastern ridge, methodical search patterns that meant they were taking this seriously. "They're treating this like a manhunt for armed suspects," Sarah observed. Celia nodded grimly, because that's what they'll report it as. Officer Blake fired on fellow officers, fled the scene, considered armed and extremely dangerous. Her voice carried bitter familiarity with how official narratives could be crafted. "By morning, you'll be the villain." The old railroad bridge came into view as they rounded another bend. Built in the 1920s to serve the coal operations that once drove Misty Hollow's economy, it now stood as a rusting monument to better times. The steel framework created deep shadows that would hide them from aerial surveillance, while the stone abutments provided shelter from the wind that was picking up as the storm system moved through. Celia led them to a space beneath the southern abutment where someone had clearly been camping. A blue tarp was stretched between concrete supports, creating a crude but effective shelter. Empty food cans were neatly stacked, and a small circle of stones marked where careful fires had been built. This was more than a temporary hiding spot. It was a home. "Yours?" Sarah asked. "Eddie's," Celia said, referring to another homeless veteran who moved through the area seasonally. "He's down in Florida until spring. Won't mind if we borrow it." Rusty immediately claimed a spot on a piece of carpet Eddie had salvaged, settling down with a contented sigh. His relaxed posture told Sarah that he'd been here before, that this place represented safety in a world where such spots were rare. Sarah examined their shelter with new appreciation. What looked like random debris to most people was actually a carefully constructed survival system. The tarp was positioned to channel rainwater into a collection bucket. Canned goods were stored in plastic containers to keep them dry. A battery-powered radio was wrapped in a garbage bag for protection. This wasn't the chaotic mess society expected from homeless camps. It was organized, practical, and showed the kind of attention to detail that kept people alive. "You've been staying here too," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Sometimes," Celia admitted, "Eddie and I have an understanding. We watch each other's backs, share resources when needed." She pulled a dry blanket from a plastic bin and offered it to Sarah. "Military brotherhood doesn't end just because you lose your housing." Sarah accepted the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders as she tried to process everything that had happened. An hour ago, she'd been a police officer investigating routine corruption. Now she was a fugitive hiding under a bridge with a homeless veteran who'd saved her life. The transformation was so complete, it felt surreal. "Tell me about your investigation," Celia said, settling cross-legged on the carpet beside Rusty. "What did you find that scared them enough to try murder?" Sarah hesitated. Every protocol she'd been trained to follow said she shouldn't discuss ongoing investigations with civilians. But protocols seemed meaningless when the people who'd written them were trying to kill her. She pulled out her phone, relieved to see it had survived their escape through the storm drain. "Started with missing evidence," Sarah said, scrolling through photos she'd taken of department records. Drug cases where substantial amounts of cocaine or heroin disappeared from the evidence locker. Always blamed on contamination or procedural errors. Celia leaned closer to look at the phone screen. Her weathered hands were steady despite their ordeal, and Sarah noticed a tattoo on her wrist, military unit designation partially obscured by a scar. "Pattern to the missing drugs?" Celia asked. "High-grade stuff, pure enough to be cut and resold at premium prices. And it only went missing from cases that were headed to trial, never from busts that resulted in plea bargains." Sarah swiped to show a spreadsheet she'd created. 17 cases in 8 months. Conservative street value of what disappeared? $250,000. Celia whistled low. That's not small-time corruption. That's organized trafficking using police resources as cover. The helicopter sounds were getting closer, forcing them to speak more quietly. Through gaps in the bridge structure above, they could see searchlights sweeping the creek downstream. The hunt was expanding systematically, which meant they had limited time before this location was compromised. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The cases that lost evidence? They all involved the same judge, Eleanor Blackwood. And the defense attorney who most often negotiated those plea bargains? Stephen Mitchell, who happens to be married to Chief Morrison's sister." Celia absorbed this information with the focused attention of someone who understood operational security. Her years on the streets had taught her that survival often depended on recognizing patterns and connections that others missed. What Sarah was describing wasn't just corruption. It was a criminal enterprise that had infiltrated multiple levels of the justice system. "Supply chain," Celia said thoughtfully. "They bust dealers, confiscate product, then put it back on the street through different channels. Clean money from dirty sources, plus they eliminate competition by arresting independent operators." "Exactly. But I couldn't prove the connection until tonight." Sarah pulled up another set of photos, these showing bank records she'd obtained through unofficial channels. Detective Kane made 3 cash deposits in the past month, each exactly 48 hours after major drug busts. Always rounded amounts. 5,000, 8,000, 10,000. "Amateur mistake," Celia observed. "Real money launderers never deal in round numbers." Sarah looked at her with new curiosity. "How do you know that?" "Military intelligence," Celia said simply. 2 tours in Afghanistan tracking Taliban drug operations. Same principles apply whether you're fighting warlords in Kandahar or corruption in Pennsylvania. This revelation added another layer to Sarah's understanding of the woman who'd saved her life. Celia wasn't just a homeless veteran struggling with civilian life. She was a trained intelligence operative with specific expertise in the exact type of criminal network they were facing. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its searchlight probing the creek bed below. Both women pressed themselves against the concrete abutment, becoming part of the shadows. Rusty remained perfectly still, his training evident in the way he controlled even his breathing. The light passed over their location twice before moving on to search further upstream. "They'll be back," Celia said once the rotor noise faded, "and they'll bring ground teams. We need to move before dawn." "Where?" Sarah asked. "They'll have roadblocks. They control communications, and they know this area better than I do." Celia smiled for the first time since their ordeal began, expression that transformed her weathered face completely. They know the official area. Roads, buildings, places law-abiding citizens go. They don't know the invisible places, the spaces that only people like me learn to see. She gestured toward the darkness beyond their shelter. "There's a whole network out there. Abandoned buildings, forgotten tunnels, places where society's discards survive. We can move through it like ghosts, gathering evidence they don't even know exists." Sarah realized she was seeing a completely different version of Misty Hollow than the one she'd patrolled for 3 years. The homeless population she'd viewed as scattered individuals were actually a connected community with their own communication systems, safe houses, and survival networks. Celia wasn't offering just hiding spots. She was offering access to an intelligence network that operated completely outside official channels. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. "Trust, Celia replied immediately, and your access codes to the police database. There are records they think they've hidden, but hidden isn't the same as deleted. Sarah handed over her phone without hesitation. Password is Sierra77 badge. As Celia navigated through the police database with surprising skill, Sarah found herself studying the woman who'd become her unlikely ally. The military bearing was obvious now that she knew what to look for. The way Celia sat with perfect posture despite their circumstances, how she maintained situational awareness even while focused on the phone screen, the practiced efficiency of her movements. Found something, Celia said quietly. Evidence locker access logs. Someone's been visiting after hours consistently, always on nights when Kane was the duty officer. She turned the phone screen towards Sarah, showing a pattern of late-night entries that coincided perfectly with the cases where evidence had gone missing. But the access codes being used weren't Kane's. They belonged to Chief Morrison himself. He's not just protecting the operation, Sarah realized, he's running it. The implications hit them both simultaneously. Chief William Morrison wasn't a corrupt cop who'd been bought by criminals. He was the criminal using his badge as cover for a sophisticated drug trafficking enterprise. Detective Kane was just muscle, and Judge Blackwood was likely either a willing participant or being blackmailed into cooperation. We need allies, Celia said. People outside the department who can help us expose this without getting killed in the process. Who? Sarah asked. Morrison has connections throughout county government. The mayor appointed him personally. Celia was quiet for a long moment, thinking through options with the methodical approach of someone who'd spent years in hostile territory. When she spoke, her voice carried a new determination. There's a woman, Patricia O'Brien, county councilwoman who's been pushing for police reform. She's clean, and she's got connections to state authorities who can't be bought with local money. You know her? She helped me get VA benefits reinstated 6 months ago, went to bat for a homeless woman nobody else would listen to. Celia's voice softened slightly. Good people still exist, even in corrupt systems. Sarah felt a flicker of hope for the first time since their escape. With Celia's street knowledge, her own evidence, and a political ally who understood systemic corruption, they might actually have a chance to expose Morrison's criminal enterprise before it destroyed more lives. But first, they had to survive the night. Dawn broke gray and cold over Misty Hollow, mist rising from the creek like ghosts of the town's industrial past. Celia had been awake for an hour, listening to the sounds that marked morning in the homeless community, distant coughing, the scrape of shopping carts on pavement, and the whispered conversations of people who lived their lives in margins nobody else noticed. Sarah stirred beneath Eddie's spare blanket, her body protesting the night spent on concrete. Her shoulder holster had left indentations in her ribs, and her hair was still damp from their escape through the storm drain. But she was alive, which was more than Chief Morrison had planned. Coffee, Celia said quietly, offering a steaming cup she'd prepared on Eddie's small camping stove. The smell was surprisingly good, rich and strong enough to cut through the morning chill. Where did you get this? Sarah asked, accepting the warmth gratefully. Eddie left a care package. Good coffee is worth more than money when you're living rough. Celia settled beside her with her own cup, watching Rusty nose around the creek bank for interesting scents. Patricia O'Brien has a breakfast meeting every Tuesday at Murphy's Diner. Starts at 7:30, always sits in the back booth. Sarah checked her phone. 6:45, and Murphy's Diner was only 10 minutes away if they stayed to the creek path that ran behind Main Street. But approaching O'Brien in a public place meant exposure. And after last night's failed assassination attempt, Morrison would have expanded surveillance throughout the town. Too risky, Sarah said. They'll have people watching every place she goes. Not every place, Celia replied with a slight smile. There's a whole world they don't see because they've trained themselves not to notice it. She led Sarah to a gap in the bridge's stone abutment where someone had carved handholds into the rock decades ago. Climbing up revealed a narrow ledge that ran along the back of buildings facing Main Street, hidden from the street by old fire escapes and accumulated debris. It was a pathway invisible to anyone who wasn't actively looking for it. Maintenance workers use this during construction, Celia explained as they moved carefully along the ledge. Now it's how people like me get around town without being seen. The perspective from above was revelatory for Sarah. She could see into second-story windows, across rooftops, and down alleys that were hidden from street level. More importantly, she could observe the town's rhythms from a position where she was completely invisible to normal surveillance. Murphy's Diner sat directly below them, its back entrance accessible via a fire escape that ended just 3 feet from their position. Through the kitchen window, they could see Dot Fleming preparing for the morning rush, her gray hair pinned back as she worked the grill with practiced efficiency. There, Celia pointed to a black sedan parked across the street from the diner's front entrance, Officer Jenny Walsh trying to look casual while running surveillance. Sarah recognized the young rookie who'd joined the department 6 months ago. Walsh was eager, ambitious, and completely loyal to Chief Morrison. Her presence confirmed that the corruption investigation had reached the highest levels of command attention. "How do we get to O'Brien without Walsh seeing us?" Sarah asked. Celia was already moving, leading them down the fire escape with movements that suggested she'd used this route before. At the bottom, a service door marked "Employees Only" stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, they could hear the sounds of breakfast preparation and see Dot Fleming's broad back as she flipped pancakes. "Mrs. Fleming," Celia called softly through the crack. The elderly woman turned, her weathered face showing recognition and concern when she saw Celia's condition. "Child, you look like you've been sleeping rough again. Come in here before you catch pneumonia." Dot held the door open, ushering them into the diner's warm kitchen. The smell of bacon and fresh biscuits created an atmosphere of comfort that seemed impossible given their circumstances. Sarah noticed how Dot's expression didn't change when she recognized the police uniform. The woman treated them both with the same maternal concern. "Patricia's in the back booth like always," Dot said, correctly interpreting their presence. "But there's a young officer watching the front entrance who's been asking questions about you, Celia. Wanted to know if I'd seen any suspicious homeless individuals in the area." "What did you tell her?" Sarah asked. Dot's smile was steel-wrapped in grandmotherly warmth. "Told her I see homeless folks every day, and they're a damn sight more trustworthy than some of the badge-wearing folks in this town." She didn't appreciate that much. Through the kitchen's pass-through window, they could see Patricia O'Brien reading a newspaper in the back booth, her gray hair immaculately styled despite the early hour. The councilwoman was a small woman with sharp eyes, who'd earned respect through 2 decades of fighting for government transparency. "Can you arrange a private meeting?" Celia asked Dot. "Honey, Patricia and I go back 40 years. She helped me keep this place open when the town council tried to condemn it for a parking lot." Dot wiped her hands on her apron decisively. "You two stay put. I'll bring her back here." While Dot approached O'Brien's table, Sarah studied the diner through the pass-through window. The morning crowd was typical for Misty Hollow. Retired coal miners nursing coffee, shift workers grabbing breakfast before heading to jobs in the county seat, and a few business owners discussing local politics. But Sarah's trained eye caught details she'd never noticed during routine patrols. Tommy Brewster sat alone in a corner booth, 19 years old, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd grown up too fast. His clothes were clean but cheap, and he kept checking his phone with nervous energy. Sarah had arrested Tommy twice for minor drug possession, but both times the charges had been reduced to community service through plea bargains arranged by Stephen Mitchell. "Kid's not eating," Celia observed, following Sarah's gaze. "Just ordered coffee and keeps watching the front door. Classic lookout behavior." "Working for Morrison's network?" "More likely running scared from it. Tommy's small time, but he moves through areas where bigger dealers don't want to be seen. Perfect for monitoring police activity in neighborhoods where residents don't trust badges." O'Brien appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression serious but controlled. She looked between Celia and Sarah with the assessing gaze of someone who'd survived local politics by quickly understanding complex situations. "Celia tells me you need help," O'Brien said without preamble. "And, judging by the APB that went out this morning, you're in more trouble than just needing VA benefits." Sarah felt a moment of confusion. "APB?" O'Brien pulled out her phone, showing a county-wide bulletin. "Officer Sarah Blake, wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of evidence and assault on fellow officers. Armed and dangerous. Approach with caution." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Morrison hadn't waited for morning to begin crafting his narrative. He'd already painted her as a corrupt cop who'd attacked her colleagues. making any attempt to expose his network look like desperate lies from a criminal trying to avoid responsibility. "It's all fabricated," Sarah said. "I know," O'Brien replied calmly. "William Morrison is many things, but subtle isn't one of them. The timing of this bulletin, combined with some irregularities I've been tracking in city finances, tells me there's a much bigger story here." Celia leaned forward intently. "What kind of irregularities?" "Unusual cash transactions through the police department's evidence disposal account. Officially, it's money from selling confiscated vehicles and other property, but the amounts don't match the documented seizures. And the paperwork always goes through Morrison's office personally." Sarah realized O'Brien had been conducting her own investigation, approaching the corruption from a financial angle rather than focusing on missing evidence. The councilwoman's political position gave her access to budget records and audit trails that weren't available to patrol officers. "How much money are we talking about?" Sarah asked. "Over the past 18 months, nearly $800,000 that can't be properly accounted for." O'Brien's voice carried the controlled anger of someone who'd devoted her career to government accountability. "That's not small-time graft, that's systematic looting." Dot Fleming appeared with a plate of eggs and bacon, setting it down in front of Celia despite her protests. "You eat," the older woman said firmly. "Can't fight corruption on an empty stomach." As Celia ate, Sarah shared the evidence she'd gathered: the missing drugs, Kane's suspicious bank deposits, and the pattern of cases that had been compromised. O'Brien listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on her phone with the focused attention of someone building a legal case. "We need federal involvement," O'Brien said finally. "State police might be compromised through Morrison's connections, but the FBI has jurisdiction over corruption cases involving interstate drug trafficking." "How do we contact them without Morrison knowing?" Sarah asked. "Through channels he can't monitor," O'Brien replied. "I have a relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia. They've been looking for an opening to investigate corruption in rural Pennsylvania law enforcement." Celia finished her eggs and looked up thoughtfully. "Federal involvement takes time. Morrison knows his window is closing, which means he'll escalate. More violence, broader intimidation, maybe even elimination of potential witnesses." The implications hung heavy in the kitchen air. Tommy Brewster and other small-time dealers who'd been part of Morrison's network could become liabilities. Honest officers who might have noticed irregularities could find themselves facing false accusations or worse. The investigation that had started with missing evidence was becoming a race against systematic witness elimination. "How long before FBI agents can get here?" Sarah asked. 48 to 72 hours for a preliminary response," O'Brien said. "Longer for a full investigation team." "Too long," Celia said definitively. "Morrison will use that time to destroy evidence and eliminate anyone who can testify against him." Through the pass-through window, they watched Tommy Brewster suddenly stand up and head for the front door. His movement was sharp, urgent, like someone who just received important information. Officer Walsh immediately started her vehicle and began following him at a discreet distance. "They're mobilizing," Celia observed. "Something's changed." O'Brien checked her phone and cursed under her breath. "Emergency city council meeting, called 20 minutes ago. Morrison's pushing through an emergency budget amendment that would give him broad powers to handle the public safety crisis created by your alleged crimes." Sarah realized Morrison was moving to consolidate power while painting himself as the hero cleaning up police corruption. By the time federal investigators arrived, he'd have legal authority to control the investigation and access to additional resources for covering his tracks. "We need to disrupt his timeline," Sarah said. "How?" O'Brien asked. Celia stood up, her decision made. "By doing what they least expect. Instead of hiding from the manhunt, we give them exactly what they're looking for." She turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed determination with calculated risk. "You're going to surrender yourself publicly, at the city council meeting, with full media coverage. But first, we're going to gather enough evidence to make Morrison's lies impossible to maintain." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "That's suicide. He'll have me killed before I can say a word." "Not if we do it right," Celia replied. "Military operations succeed through superior intelligence and timing. We have both advantages. We know his network, and we know when he'll be most vulnerable." O'Brien was nodding slowly, understanding the strategic value of Celia's proposal. A public surrender forces Morrison to respond in front of witnesses and cameras. He can't simply eliminate you without exposing himself. But we need insurance, Celia continued. Evidence so compelling that killing you would only confirm your testimony. She looked at both women with the focused intensity Sarah had seen the night before in the alley. There's a drug shipment coming through tonight. I know where, when, and who's involved. We document Morrison's personal participation, then use O'Brien's political platform to make the evidence public before they can react. How do you know about the shipment? Sarah asked. Celia's smile was grim. Because the homeless community sees everything, we're invisible to them, which makes us the perfect intelligence network. For the first time since their escape, Sarah felt hope mixing with her fear. Celia wasn't just offering hiding spots. She was proposing a full military-style operation to expose and destroy Morrison's criminal enterprise. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also their only chance to turn the tables before the corruption consumed more victims. What do you need from me? O'Brien asked. Public pressure and media attention, Celia replied. Make sure tonight's city council meeting has maximum visibility. And from me? Sarah asked. Trust, Celia said simply, and your willingness to walk into the lion's den when the time comes. Outside, the morning rush was beginning, but inside Murphy's kitchen, 3 women from different worlds were planning to bring down a criminal empire that had infected their community. The ghost was about to become visible, and when she did, nothing in Misty Hollow would ever be the same. The abandoned Kowalski auto repair shop sat on the edge of Misty Hollow like a monument to economic decline, its windows boarded and parking lot cracked with weeds growing through asphalt. But to Celia, it represented something more valuable than nostalgia, a perfect observation post with clear sightlines to Copper Creek Bridge, where tonight's drug transfer would take place. She led Sarah through a gap in the chain-link fence that surrounded the property, moving with the confidence of someone who'd scouted this location thoroughly. Rusty trotted alongside, his nose working to catalog the scents of motor oil, rust, and the small animals that had claimed the building as territory. Frank Kowalski was a good man, Celia said as they approached the shop's rear entrance. Fixed cars for people who couldn't afford to pay, let folks sleep in his waiting room during winter storms. When the economy crashed and killed his business, he made sure the homeless community knew this place would stay open. The back door yielded to pressure from Celia's shoulder, revealing an interior that had been stripped of valuable equipment but retained its basic structure. Hydraulic lifts stood frozen in place, and tool cabinets lined the walls like metal sentinels. But someone had been maintaining the space. The floor was swept clean, and plastic tarps protected areas where people obviously slept. Community center, Sarah observed, understanding the dynamics she was witnessing. Winter shelter, message center, medical clinic when Dr. Vasquez from the VA makes her rounds, Celia confirmed. Places like this are why people like me survive more than just weather. They climbed a narrow staircase to Frank's old office, which overlooked both the bridge and the road leading to it. Through grimy windows, they had a perfect view of the creek where Detective Kane would meet his suppliers in approximately 8 hours. More importantly, they could observe without being seen by anyone conducting normal surveillance. Sarah settled beside the window while Celia arranged camping gear she'd retrieved from hidden caches around the building. The homeless woman moved with military efficiency, setting up equipment for what was essentially a reconnaissance mission in hostile territory. Tell me about Afghanistan, Sarah said as they settled in for the long wait ahead. Celia paused in her preparations, her weathered hands stilling on a pair of binoculars that had obviously seen military service. 2 tours, 2009 to 2013. Intelligence specialist attached to Special Forces units conducting counter-narcotics operations. Her voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting facts rather than sharing memories. That's where you learned about drug trafficking networks? Taliban-controlled poppy production in our sector used the profits to fund IED attacks against American convoys. Celia's eyes grew distant, focused on something beyond the grimy window. We'd track their supply chains, document their methods, sometimes interdicted shipments worth millions of dollars. Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. Outside, the morning sun was burning off the mist that perpetually hung over Misty Hollow's creek bottoms. revealing the industrial landscape that had once provided prosperity for families like the Kowalskis. "Lost my squad in 2012, Celia continued quietly. "Roadside bomb on what should have been a routine patrol. I was the only survivor because I'd stayed behind to coordinate with local intelligence sources." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Spent 8 months in military hospitals, then 2 years fighting the VA for disability benefits." The story explained much about Celia's current circumstances. Combat trauma, combined with bureaucratic indifference, had created a path from decorated veteran to homeless survivor. It was a journey too many soldiers had taken, invisible to the society they'd served. "When did you end up on the streets?" Sarah asked gently. 6 months after discharge," Celia replied. "Medical bills from civilian hospitals, rent I couldn't pay while fighting for benefits, family that couldn't understand why I couldn't just get over it and find a job." She scratched Rusty behind the ears, drawing comfort from the contact. "Found Rusty at a kill shelter 3 weeks before I lost my apartment. Figured if I was going to be homeless, at least I wouldn't be alone." Sarah felt a surge of anger at the system that had failed someone who'd sacrificed so much for her country. But she also recognized the strength it had taken for Celia to survive 18 months on the streets while maintaining her dignity and developing the skills that were now keeping them both alive. "How did you end up in Misty Hollow specifically?" "VA hospital in Philadelphia was where I was getting treatment," Celia explained. "But city shelters are dangerous, especially for women veterans. Too much violence, too many drugs, too many predators who see military training as a threat to their territory." She gestured toward the windows overlooking the creek. "Small towns are safer if you know how to stay invisible." The morning passed slowly as they maintained watch on the bridge. Celia used the time to explain the invisible infrastructure that supported Misty Hollow's homeless population: network of trusted locations, communication systems based on subtle markers, and informal economy based on mutual aid rather than money. "See that shopping cart by the creek?" Celia pointed to what looked like abandoned debris. "It's positioned to signal that the area is safe for camping. If it was turned sideways, it would mean police activity. Upside down means danger." Sarah was beginning to understand that what appeared to be random urban decay was actually a sophisticated survival system. The homeless community had developed their own language, their own intelligence network, and their own methods for navigating a world that preferred not to acknowledge their existence. Around noon, Eddie Wheels Murphy arrived at the auto shop, pushing a shopping cart loaded with salvaged metal and recognizable immediately by his missing left leg below the knee. He moved with practiced efficiency despite his prosthetic, navigating the uneven ground like someone who'd adapted completely to his circumstances. "Celia!" Eddie's weathered face broke into a genuine smile as he spotted them in the office window. "Heard you had some excitement last night." "Word travels fast," Celia replied as they came downstairs to greet him. "Faster than you might think," Eddie said, his expression growing serious. "Morrison's got people asking questions all over town. Offering cash for information about a homeless woman with a German Shepherd who might be helping that rogue cop everyone's talking about." Sarah felt a chill of concern. "How much cash?" $500, Eddie replied. "Enough to tempt people who ain't eaten regular meals in months." The bounty represented a serious escalation in Morrison's tactics. By putting a price on information about Celia, he was weaponizing the homeless community's desperation against itself. Some people would resist, but others might see $500 as worth the risk of betraying someone they barely knew. "Anyone taking the offer?" Celia asked. "Not so far, but the day's young," Eddie admitted. "Most folks remember how you helped Jenny Martinez when her kid got sick, or how you shared food with Tom Chen when he was going through withdrawal. But desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider." Celia absorbed this information with the calm assessment of someone who'd faced worse betrayals. "How long before word gets back to Morrison about this location?" "Hard to say," Eddie replied, "but I'd be ready to move by nightfall regardless." As if summoned by their conversation, a familiar figure appeared on the road leading to the bridge. Detective Kane drove slowly in an unmarked vehicle, conducting what appeared to be routine reconnaissance of the evening's planned location, but his presence confirmed that tonight's operation was proceeding as scheduled. "There's our confirmation," Celia said, watching Kane through binoculars. "Transfer's still on." Sarah studied Kane's methodical approach to the site. He parked at 3 different locations, walked the area on foot, and even tested cell phone reception at various points. The thoroughness suggested this wasn't a routine drug deal. It was a major transaction, requiring careful operational security. "What time?" Sarah asked. "Eddie?" Celia deferred to the older veteran's knowledge of local patterns. "Morrison's crew usually moves product between midnight and 2 a.m., Eddie said. "Late enough that honest folks are asleep, early enough that shift workers haven't started their commutes." The timeline gave them approximately 12 hours to prepare for the most dangerous phase of their operation. They needed to position themselves for surveillance without being detected, document Morrison's personal involvement in the transaction, and escape with evidence that could bring down his entire network. "I need to make some calls," Sarah said, thinking about the federal contacts O'Brien had mentioned. "Get backup plans in place in case this goes wrong." "No phone calls from here," Celia said firmly. "Morrison has resources to monitor communications, and we can't risk electronic surveillance compromising our position." Eddie nodded agreement. Best to assume they're listening to everything except face-to-face conversations. Sarah realized she was still thinking like a police officer operating within legitimate systems, while their situation required the mindset of insurgents operating in occupied territory. Every assumption about communication, transportation, and support had to be reconsidered. "How do we coordinate with O'Brien?" Sarah asked. "Old-fashioned dead drop," Celia replied. "There's a loose brick in the wall behind St. Anthony's Church, where people leave messages for Father Santos when they need help. We put our documentation there. Eddie delivers word to O'Brien about the location." The plan was elegantly simple, requiring no electronic communications that could be intercepted. It also leveraged the homeless community's existing networks in ways that Morrison couldn't predict or counter. Eddie spent the afternoon bringing intelligence from his networks throughout Misty Hollow. Morrison had increased patrols throughout the town, particularly around areas where homeless people congregated. Officer Walsh was coordinating with county sheriff's deputies to expand the search for Sarah. Most concerning, Chief Morrison had personally visited Judge Blackwood's home for a meeting that lasted over an hour. They're coordinating their stories, Sarah realized, making sure everyone's version of events supports Morrison's narrative. "Or eliminating loose ends," Celia said grimly. Blackwood might be feeling pressure to distance herself from the operation. As afternoon faded toward evening, the auto shop filled with a nervous energy that reminded Sarah of pre-mission briefings during her police training. But instead of official backup and departmental resources, they had only their wits, Eddie's street knowledge, and Celia's military experience. "Last chance to reconsider," Celia said as they prepared their surveillance equipment. "Once we're out there, we're committed to seeing this through." Sarah thought about her oath as a police officer, her duty to protect and serve the community that had trusted her with authority. Morrison's corruption had perverted that trust, turning the badge into a tool for personal enrichment rather than public safety. "I became a cop to fight crime," Sarah said firmly. "That doesn't change just because the criminals are wearing badges." Celia smiled with genuine respect. "Then let's go catch some criminals." As darkness settled over Misty Hollow, 3 unlikely allies prepared to confront a corruption that had infected their community. Outside, the bridge waited under cover of night, unaware that its secrets were about to be exposed by people society had trained itself not to see. Midnight in Misty Hollow brought the kind of absolute darkness that only existed in rural Pennsylvania, where streetlights ended at the town limits and mountains blocked ambient light from distant cities. Celia moved through this darkness like she'd been born to it, leading Sarah along paths invisible to anyone who hadn't learned to navigate by sound, smell, and memory. They approached Copper Creek Bridge from the upstream side, staying low along the creek bank where century-old willows provided natural concealment. Rusty padded silently beside them, his dark coat making him nearly invisible against the shadows. 20 yards from the bridge, Celia signaled for them to stop. "There," she whispered, pointing to a black SUV parked on the far side of the bridge with its lights extinguished. Sarah squinted through the night vision scope she'd borrowed from Eddie's collection of military surplus equipment. 2 figures sat in the vehicle's front seats, their faces illuminated occasionally by cell phone screens. She recognized neither of them, which meant Morrison was bringing in outside talent for this operation. "Professional crew," Celia observed, studying their positioning through her own binoculars. "Vehicles positioned for quick exit, occupants maintaining visual surveillance of approach routes. This isn't local talent." The implications were sobering. If Morrison was importing criminals from outside Misty Hollow, it suggested his operation had grown beyond what local corrupt officials could handle internally. They were witnessing an enterprise that had graduated from small-town graft to interstate organized crime. A second vehicle approached from the direction of town, headlights cutting through the darkness before being extinguished as it reached the bridge. This one Sarah recognized immediately. Chief Morrison's personal pickup truck, a lifted Ford that he'd purchased with money that supposedly came from his police salary. Morrison emerged from the truck alone, but Sarah noticed how he scanned their surroundings with the systematic attention of someone who expected surveillance. He was wearing civilian clothes, but his posture and movement patterns still screamed law enforcement training. "Recording," Sarah whispered, activating the camera function on her phone while keeping it concealed behind a fallen log. Through the night vision scope, she watched Morrison approach the SUV and engage in conversation with its occupants. Money changed hands. A thick envelope passed from Morrison to the driver while a duffel bag moved in the opposite direction. "Product delivery," Celia said quietly. "They're paying Morrison for police protection while he takes possession of drugs for redistribution through his network." But what happened next surprised both women. Instead of departing immediately, Morrison opened the duffel bag and began dividing its contents into smaller packages. His movements were practiced, efficient, suggesting this wasn't his first time personally handling drug distribution. He's not just providing protection, Sarah realized. He's running the entire operation. A third vehicle arrived, Detective Kane in his personal sedan. Kane joined Morrison at the bridge's center, where they continued dividing the drug shipment into smaller units. The conversation between them was animated, with gestures that suggested disagreement about something. "Trouble in paradise," Celia observed. Through the night vision scope, Sarah could see Kane's agitation clearly. He kept pointing toward town, then back at the drug packages, his body language suggesting he wanted to end the meeting quickly. Morrison appeared to be overruling his concerns, continuing the distribution process despite Kane's obvious nervousness. "Kane's spooked," Sarah whispered. "Something's got him rattled." Her question was answered moments later when a fourth vehicle appeared, not from the direction of town, but from the rural road that led to the county line. This was a van, larger than the other vehicles, and it moved with the deliberate pace of someone conducting counter-surveillance. Morrison and Kane both froze as the van approached. Sarah could see them exchanging urgent words, but instead of fleeing, Morrison waved the van forward. Whoever was driving had been expected, which meant this operation involved more participants than they'd anticipated. The van stopped 50 yards from the bridge, and its side doors slid open. In the darkness, Sarah couldn't make out faces, but she could see multiple figures emerging and approaching Morrison's group. The drug distribution operation was becoming a full criminal convention. "Too many players," Celia said, her military training analyzing the tactical situation. "This many people means more weapons, more communication channels, higher probability of detection." Sarah realized they were witnessing something far beyond routine corruption. Morrison wasn't just stealing evidence and reselling it. He was coordinating a regional distribution network that brought drugs from outside suppliers and dispersed them through multiple local channels. One of the figures from the van approached Morrison directly, and even in the darkness, Sarah could see this person commanded deference from everyone present. Morrison actually stepped back, adopting the submissive posture of someone receiving orders rather than giving them. "Morrison's not the boss," Sarah whispered in shock. "Never was," Celia replied. "Mid-level management at best. Real powers coming from outside Misty Hollow." This revelation changed everything about their investigation. The corruption they'd discovered wasn't locally generated crime that had infected the police department. It was an outside criminal organization that had recruited Morrison as their local enforcement arm. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with packages being exchanged, money changing hands, and what appeared to be detailed coordination of future operations. Sarah documented everything her phone's camera could capture, knowing that federal prosecutors would need evidence of the scope and organization of the criminal enterprise. But their surveillance was interrupted by a sound that made both women's blood freeze, footsteps approaching through the darkness behind them. "Don't move," a voice said quietly, "hands where I can see them." Sarah's heart hammered as she recognized Officer Ginny Walsh's voice. The young rookie had somehow detected their position and was now holding them at gunpoint, while Morrison's criminal meeting continued just yards away. "Turn around slowly," Walsh commanded. Sarah and Celia complied, raising their hands while trying to assess their situation. Walsh stood 15 feet away, her service weapon drawn but not yet aimed directly at them. Her face was pale in the moonlight, and her hands trembled slightly with nervous energy. "Officer Walsh," Sarah said carefully, "you need to see what's happening on that bridge." "I know what's happening," Walsh replied, but her voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. "Chief Morrison is conducting undercover surveillance of suspected drug activity." Sarah realized Walsh genuinely believed Morrison's cover story. The young officer thought she was helping to arrest drug dealers, not protecting them. Morrison had manipulated her into providing security for his criminal operation while keeping her ignorant of the truth. "Look at the bridge," Celia said quietly. "Use your binoculars and tell me what you see." Walsh hesitated, clearly conflicted between following orders and investigating what her eyes were telling her. For a long moment, she maintained her weapon's position, while glancing toward the bridge where Morrison was still coordinating with his criminal associates. "He's talking to them," Walsh said slowly, confusion creeping into her voice. "He's working with them," Sarah said. "Jenny, Morrison is running a drug distribution network using the police department as cover. That's why I'm wanted. I discovered evidence of his crimes." Walsh's weapon wavered as cognitive dissonance warred with loyalty in her mind. She'd been taught to trust her chain of command, but what she was witnessing directly contradicted everything she'd been told about tonight's operation. "That's impossible," Walsh said, but her conviction was cracking. "Chief Morrison he's a good cop." "Good cops don't meet with drug dealers at midnight," Celia said gently, "and they don't divide drug shipments into distribution packages." On the bridge, Morrison's meeting was concluding. The van's occupants were returning to their vehicle, while Morrison and Kane loaded packages into their respective vehicles. In minutes, they would disperse, and the opportunity to expose the entire network would disappear. "You have to choose," Sarah said urgently. "Trust what Morrison told you, or trust what your eyes are showing you." Walsh looked between them and the bridge, her young face struggling with a decision that would define her career and possibly her life. The weapon in her hands represented authority she'd been taught to respect, but the evidence before her eyes represented truth she couldn't ignore. "If you're lying," Walsh said finally, "if this is some kind of setup, then arrest us after we document what's happening," Sarah replied. "But if we're telling the truth, and you help Morrison escape, you become part of the cover-up." Celia slowly reached for her binoculars, moving carefully to avoid triggering Walsh's nervous finger. "Look for yourself," she said, offering the military-grade optics. "See what a real criminal conspiracy looks like." Walsh accepted the binoculars with her free hand, keeping her weapon ready while focusing on Morrison's activities. Through the enhanced magnification, she could see details that had been hidden in the darkness: the money-changing hands, the careful division of drug packages, the deference Morrison showed to his criminal associates. "Oh God," Walsh whispered as the truth became undeniable. "Now you understand," Sarah said quietly. "Morrison has been using young officers like you to provide security for his criminal operations while keeping you ignorant of what you're really protecting." Walsh lowered her weapon completely, the weight of realization settling over her like a physical burden. "How many others know?" "Kane, definitely," Sarah replied. "Judge Blackwood, probably. Maybe others in the department who've been compromised or intimidated into silence." On the bridge, Morrison was concluding his business and preparing to depart. The criminal meeting that had taken months to arrange was ending, and with it, their opportunity to gather evidence of the larger conspiracy. "What do we do now?" Walsh asked, her voice small in the darkness. Celia was already moving, gathering their surveillance equipment with practiced efficiency. "Now we get this evidence to people who can act on it," she said, "before Morrison realizes his security has been compromised." The three women retreated from their observation position as Morrison's convoy began to disperse. Behind them, the bridge returned to darkness, but the criminal conspiracy they'd witnessed would soon face the light of federal investigation. Walsh's conversion from unwitting accomplice to ally had changed the balance of their struggle against Morrison's corruption, but it had also started a clock that would force decisive action before their new evidence could be suppressed, or their growing coalition could be silenced permanently. St. Anthony's Catholic Church stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky like a sanctuary from another century, its Gothic spire reaching towards stars that were beginning to fade with approaching sunrise. Father Miguel Santos unlocked the heavy wooden doors at 4:30 a.m., as he had every morning for the past 12 years, unaware that his routine was about to intersect with a conspiracy that threatened to destroy his community. On the way a.m., Celia, Sarah, and Jenny Walsh approached through the cemetery behind the church, moving between weathered headstones that marked generations of Misty Hollow families who'd lived and died when the town had different dreams. Rusty trotted silently among the graves, his presence somehow fitting in a place where so many other loyal companions lay buried beside their masters. Father Santos doesn't ask questions, Celia said as they reached the loose brick behind the church that served as the community's informal message center, but he remembers everything, and he's got connections to state authorities through the Catholic diocese. Sarah's phone contained nearly an hour of video evidence documenting Morrison's criminal meeting, but getting that evidence to federal investigators without being intercepted required navigation through communication channels that Morrison couldn't monitor or control. The church's long-standing relationship with state oversight agencies provided exactly that kind of protected pathway. Jenny Walsh still moved with the shell-shocked uncertainty of someone whose entire worldview had crumbled in the space of 20 minutes. She joined the police force to serve her community, only to discover that her own chief had been using her dedication to protect criminal operations. "How long has this been going on?" Jenny asked as Celia composed a message explaining the evidence's location. "Based on the financial irregularities O'Brien discovered, at least 18 months, Sarah replied, but the outside criminal involvement suggests it's been building toward this for much longer. Father Santos emerged from the church's side entrance, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the kind of simple work clothes that marked him as a pastor who got his hands dirty serving his congregation. He was a compact man in his 50s with graying hair and the alert eyes of someone who'd learned to read people's needs without being told. "Celia," he said with genuine warmth, showing no surprise at finding her in his cemetery at dawn, "I heard there was some excitement in town last night." "More than excitement, Father," Celia replied. "We need to get information to authorities outside Morrison's reach." Santos nodded without hesitation. "Bishop Kellerman has breakfast with the State Attorney General every month. They discuss prison ministry programs, but I suspect other topics come up as well." This was exactly the kind of protected communication channel they needed. Religious hierarchy operated independently of local law enforcement, with direct access to state officials who couldn't be compromised by Morrison's limited sphere of influence. "How quickly can you reach the bishop?" Sarah asked. "He's an early riser," Santos replied, already pulling out his phone. "Give me 20 minutes." While Father Santos made his calls, the three women settled in the church's basement kitchen where volunteers prepared meals for Misty Hollow's hungry residents. The smell of coffee and yesterday's bread created an atmosphere of safety that felt almost foreign after their night in the darkness. Jenny sat at the worn wooden table where countless community meetings had been held, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I keep thinking about all the times Morrison praised my work," she said quietly. "Every arrest I made that he commended, every case he said I'd handled perfectly." "He was using your integrity against you," Celia said gently. "Good cops make perfect cover for criminal operations because their honest behavior deflects suspicion from the corruption happening around them." Sarah understood the psychological manipulation Jenny was struggling to process. Morrison had weaponized her idealism, using her genuine dedication to police work as camouflage for his criminal enterprise. The betrayal went beyond professional disappointment. It struck at the core of Jenny's identity. "What happens to the cases I worked?" Jenny asked. "If Morrison was manipulating evidence, how many innocent people did I help convict?" It was a question that would haunt Jenny for years, and one that demonstrated the full scope of damage corruption caused to the justice system. Every case touched by Morrison's influence would need review. Every conviction would face scrutiny, and every victim would question whether justice had truly been served. Father Santos returned with encouraging news. "Bishop Kellerman is personally driving here from Harrisburg. He'll arrive by 8 a.m., and he's bringing someone from the State Attorney General's office who specializes in law enforcement corruption cases." The timeline gave them roughly 3 hours before state authorities could begin formal investigation procedures. But 3 hours also gave Morrison time to discover that his security had been compromised and take steps to protect himself and his criminal associates. "We need to assume Morrison knows," Sarah said. "Standard procedure after any sensitive operation is to debrief all security personnel. When Jenny doesn't report back with the expected intelligence, he'll start asking questions." Celia was already thinking tactically. Eddie's networks can provide early warning if Morrison starts mobilizing for a manhunt, but we need to consider that he might escalate to eliminate witnesses rather than risk federal investigation. The prospect of Morrison resorting to murder to protect his operation was sobering but realistic. They documented evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving millions of dollars and multiple interstate participants. People had killed for far less, and Morrison had the resources and authority to make deaths look accidental. Tommy Brewster, Ginny said suddenly. If Morrison starts eliminating witnesses, Tommy will be high on the list. He's been running drugs for the network, but he's also young and scared enough to cooperate with investigators. Sarah realized Jenny was right. Tommy represented exactly the kind of vulnerable witness that criminal organizations eliminated to prevent cooperation with law enforcement. His youth and desperation made him both valuable as a source of information and dangerous as a potential liability. Where would Tommy go if he felt threatened? Celia asked. Pine Ridge Trailer Park, Jenny replied. Lives there with his grandmother, but she works night shifts at the hospital. He'd be alone and unprotected. The trailer park sat on the outskirts of Misty Hollow, connected to town by a single road that could be easily monitored or blocked. If Morrison decided to eliminate Tommy as a witness, the isolated location would provide perfect cover for making a murder look like a drug deal gone wrong. We need to get him to safety, Sarah said. And do what with him? Celia asked practically. We're fugitives ourselves, and Morrison controls local law enforcement. Where do we take him that's actually safe? Father Santos had been listening to their conversation with the focused attention of someone who dealt with life and death situations before. The diocese maintains a safe house in Philadelphia for people fleeing domestic violence, he said. It's not officially part of any government program, which means Morrison wouldn't know to look there. This solution addressed both Tommy's immediate safety and the need to keep him available for federal investigators. But getting him from Pine Ridge to Philadelphia required transportation through territory that Morrison could monitor and block with official police resources. I can get him there, Jenny said with sudden determination. I'm still officially a police officer, and my patrol car has access to all county roads. Morrison won't expect me to be helping his targets. Celia studied Jenny with approval. You understand this makes you a target too? Once Morrison realizes you've switched sides, he'll treat you like any other threat to his operation. Good, Jenny replied with steel in her voice. I'd rather be honest and hunted than comfortable and complicit. The plan was dangerous, but feasible. Ginny would retrieve Tommy from Pine Ridge while Sarah and Celia remained at the church to meet with state authorities. If Morrison discovered their activities, at least Tommy would be safe and available to provide testimony that could corroborate the video evidence. As Ginny prepared to leave, Father Santos handed her a letter of introduction to the safe house operators. Tell them Father Santos sent you, he said. They'll ask no questions and keep him safe until federal agents can arrange formal protection. Dawn was breaking over Misty Hollow as Ginny departed for Pine Ridge, her patrol car disappearing into morning mist that shrouded the valley like a protective veil. But protection was temporary, and everyone involved understood they were racing against time before Morrison discovered his security had been comprehensively compromised. How long before he knows? Sarah asked Celia. Standard military practice is immediate debriefing after any operation, Celia replied. If Morrison follows similar protocols, he'll expect contact from Jenny within the hour. They settled in to wait for Bishop Kellerman's arrival, knowing that each passing minute brought them closer to either salvation through federal intervention or catastrophe through Morrison's retaliation. Outside, Misty Hollow was beginning to wake up, unaware that its future hung in the balance of a confrontation between corruption and justice that had been building for months. On Kareka, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia O'Brien. Emergency City Council meeting postponed to tonight. Morrison claiming need for additional security briefings due to ongoing manhunt. The postponement confirmed their worst fears. Morrison was buying time to eliminate evidence and witnesses before federal authorities could intervene. The race they'd been running since escaping the alley behind Murphy's Diner was entering its final phase, with everything depending on whether state investigators could move faster than a corrupt police chief desperate to protect his criminal empire. In the church's peaceful kitchen, surrounded by the tools of community service and charity, 3 women prepared for what might be their final confrontation with institutional corruption that had infected their home. Outside, Eddie's networks would carry word through invisible channels, while inside, they waited for officials who represented justice beyond Morrison's reach. But time was running out, and everyone involved understood that when it did, the price of failure would be measured in more than lost careers or damaged reputations. Morrison had already shown his willingness to kill to protect his operation, and desperate criminals were dangerous in ways that tested every limit of courage and conviction. Bishop Kellerman arrived precisely at 8 a.m. in a black sedan that looked unremarkable until you noticed the bulletproof glass and reinforced frame. He emerged with the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent decades navigating between spiritual ministry and political reality, followed by a woman in her 40s whose federal credentials were visible in every carefully controlled movement. Investigator Lisa Park, Pennsylvania State Police Internal Affairs. The woman introduced herself to Sarah with a firm handshake. "We've been tracking corruption indicators in rural departments for 6 months. Your evidence might be the breakthrough we've needed." Celia studied Park with the assessing gaze she'd once used to evaluate Afghan intelligence sources. The investigator carried herself with competent authority, but more importantly, she showed none of the defensive reactions that characterized corrupt officials. Her questions were sharp, focused, and designed to gather facts rather than discredit sources. "Show me what you've documented," Park said, settling at the church kitchen table where community volunteers usually planned food distributions. Sarah transferred the video files to Park's encrypted tablet, watching the investigator's expression grow increasingly grim as Morrison's criminal meeting played out in high-definition clarity. The evidence was devastating. Clear documentation of a police chief personally coordinating with interstate drug traffickers. "This changes everything," Park said finally. "We suspected corruption, but this shows systematic criminal enterprise using law enforcement as protection." Bishop Kellerman had been reviewing additional documentation Sarah had compiled over weeks of investigation. His weathered face reflected the kind of moral outrage that had driven reform movements throughout history. "How many other communities are facing similar infiltration?" the bishop asked. "More than we'd like to admit," Park replied. Rural police departments are particularly vulnerable because they lack oversight mechanisms that exist in larger jurisdictions. A corrupt chief can control information flow completely. Father Santos appeared with fresh coffee and the kind of homemade pastries that marked important occasions in church life. But beneath his hospitality lay visible tension as he processed the implications of what was happening in his community. "What about protection for people who've helped expose this?" Santos asked. "Celia's been living on the streets, surviving on nothing, but she risked everything to document Morrison's crimes." Park's expression softened as she looked at Celia, recognizing something that went beyond simple civic duty. Federal witness protection programs exist, but they require complete life changes. New identity, relocation, cutting ties with everything familiar. "Not interested," Celia said immediately. "I've been invisible for 18 months. What I want is to be visible on my own terms, in my own community." The response surprised Park, who was accustomed to witnesses eager to escape rather than confront the aftermath of their testimony. But Celia's military background had taught her that running from problems rarely solved them permanently. Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Eddie. "Morrison's at the station, demanding to know Walsh's location, sending additional units to search Pine Ridge area." The message confirmed their worst fears. Morrison had discovered that Jenny hadn't reported back from her surveillance assignment, and he was mobilizing resources to locate her before she could compromise his operation further. "We need to move," Sarah said, showing the message to Park. "Morrison knows his security is compromised." Park was already activating her own communication systems, contacting federal agents who'd been positioned outside Misty Hollow pending her assessment. "FBI task force is 20 minutes out," she said. "But if Morrison's mobilizing local resources, we might not have 20 minutes." Through the church's windows, they could see unusual activity on Main Street. Police vehicles were moving with urgent purpose, and radio chatter was audible from blocks away. Morrison wasn't conducting a routine manhunt. He was orchestrating a military-style operation to eliminate threats to his criminal empire. "He'll go after Tommy first," Celia said, reading Morrison's tactical priorities with military precision. "Young, scared, knows enough to destroy the entire network. Classic witness elimination target." Park nodded grimly. "Where's Officer Walsh now?" "Pine Ridge Trailer Park, extracting Tommy Brewster," Sarah replied. But if Morrison's sending units there, she's walking into an ambush. The implications hung heavy in the church kitchen. Jenny was attempting to save Tommy's life, but she might be sacrificing her own in the process. Morrison had the resources to make her death look like a confrontation with armed suspects, especially if he controlled the crime scene investigation afterward. "Can you reach her?" Park asked. Sarah tried calling Jenny's personal phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. Either Jenny was maintaining communication security, or something had already gone wrong at Pine Ridge. Eddie arrived at the church moving faster than anyone had seen him move despite his prosthetic leg, his shopping cart abandoned in favor of urgent speed. His weathered face was flushed with exertion and alarm. "Morrison's got roadblocks," Eddie reported breathlessly. "County deputies at every road leading out of town, checking all vehicles. They're not looking for suspects. They're preventing anyone from leaving." This was martial law in everything but name. Morrison was using his authority to seal Misty Hollow's boundaries, trapping potential witnesses inside a perimeter he could control completely. The tactic suggested desperation, but also revealed the scope of resources at his disposal. "How many county deputies does he control?" Park asked. "Unknown," Sarah replied, "but enough to coordinate a complete traffic shutdown across multiple jurisdictions." Park's expression darkened as she realized the implications. Morrison's corruption network extended beyond Misty Hollow into county government, possibly including the sheriff's department that was supposed to provide oversight for local police operations. "Federal agents are encountering unexpected delays at the roadblocks," Park said, monitoring updates on her secure communication device. "Morrison's people are using official traffic safety justifications to slow their approach." Celia absorbed this tactical information with the kind of calm analysis that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. "He's buying time for cleanup operations," she said. "Eliminate witnesses, destroy evidence, establish plausible cover stories for federal investigators." Through the church windows, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the police station. Morrison was burning something, probably documents that could link him to criminal activities beyond what the video evidence already proved. "We need to get to Pine Ridge," Sarah said. "Jenny and Tommy are walking into a kill zone." "Too late," Eddie said grimly. "Road to Pine Ridge is blocked by 2 sheriff's vehicles. They're not letting anyone through, including emergency vehicles." The isolation tactic meant that whatever happened at Pine Ridge would occur without witnesses or interference. Morrison had created a perfect environment for eliminating threats, while maintaining plausible deniability about the circumstances. Bishop Kellerman had been making phone calls to his own networks throughout the conversation. "Governor's office is dispatching state police helicopters," he announced, "but they need landing coordinates outside Morrison's perimeter." Park immediately began coordinating helicopter deployment, while Sarah studied local maps for potential landing sites. But air support would take time to arrive, and time was exactly what Morrison was trying to eliminate. "There's another way to Pine Ridge," Celia said quietly. "Hiking trail through the state forest that connects to the back of the trailer park. Morrison's roadblocks won't cover foot traffic." Sarah looked at the map Celia was indicating. The trail was marked as difficult and covered nearly 3 miles of rough terrain, but it would bring them to Pine Ridge from an unexpected direction. "How long?" Sarah asked. 45 minutes if we push hard," Celia replied, "but we'd be going in without backup, against unknown numbers of armed officers." The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. Jenny had risked everything to help them expose Morrison's corruption, and now she needed the same kind of support she'd provided. Sarah had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that oath didn't become meaningless just because other officers had betrayed it. "I'm going," Sarah said firmly. "Not alone," Celia replied immediately, "and not without proper equipment." Father Santos had been listening to their planning with the focused attention of someone who'd served in Vietnam before joining the priesthood. He disappeared into the church's storage areas and returned with military surplus gear that suggested the parish had prepared for emergencies beyond spiritual crises. "Body armor, night vision, communications equipment," Santos explained, laying out professional-grade equipment. "Diocese maintains emergency supplies for protecting refugee families. Consider this protecting refugees from corruption." Park checked her watch, calculating arrival times for federal support against the urgency of the situation at Pine Ridge. "FBI task force is delayed at roadblocks. State police helicopters are 30 minutes out, and we have no communication with Officer Walsh or Tommy Brewster." "Then we go now," Celia said, already strapping on body armor with practiced efficiency. Military principle: when your allies are in danger, you don't wait for permission to help them. Sarah felt the weight of equipment settle around her shoulders, but more importantly, she felt the weight of responsibility that had driven her to become a police officer in the first place. Morrison had corrupted the badge she wore, but he couldn't corrupt the oath she'd taken to protect innocent people. Eddie provided final intelligence updates as they prepared to depart. Morrison's got 4 units at Pine Ridge, plus Detective Kane coordinating from the trailer park entrance. They're not conducting searches, they're establishing a perimeter. The tactical assessment confirmed Celia's worst fears. Morrison wasn't trying to arrest Jenny and Tommy. He was preparing to execute them while creating circumstances that would justify their deaths to investigators who arrived afterward. One more thing, Eddie added quietly. Some of the homeless folks in that area saw a van matching the description from last night's meeting. Outside talent is already in position. Professional killers working with corrupt police created a combination that tested every limit of courage and tactical planning. But Sarah and Celia had advantages that Morrison couldn't anticipate: military training, intimate knowledge of terrain, and the kind of desperate determination that came from fighting for justice against institutional corruption. "Ready?" Celia asked, checking the action on a rifle Father Santos had provided. Sarah nodded, understanding that they were crossing a line from investigation to active resistance. But Morrison had crossed that line first when he decided to use murder to protect his criminal empire. As they departed through the church's back entrance into morning light that was already growing warm, Sarah realized their mission represented something larger than saving 2 people. They were fighting for the idea that corruption couldn't triumph through violence, that justice existed beyond the reach of criminals wearing badges. Behind them, federal agents worked to penetrate Morrison's perimeter while state investigators documented evidence that would eventually destroy his network. Ahead lay a confrontation that would test whether ordinary people could defeat institutional evil through courage, planning, and unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent. The ghost was fully visible now, and she was going to war. The State Forest Trail wound through dense Pennsylvania woodland that had reclaimed abandoned mining sites, creating a landscape of hidden dangers and unexpected opportunities. Celia moved through this terrain with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd learned tactical movement in places where mistakes meant death, while Sarah struggled to match her pace despite superior physical conditioning. Rusty ranged ahead of them, his senses alert for threats that human perception might miss. His military working dog training had never fully left him, and he understood the urgency that drove his companions through increasingly difficult terrain. "Motion ahead," Celia whispered, dropping to one knee behind a massive oak tree that bore scars from logging operations decades past. Through binoculars, Sarah could see Pine Ridge Trailer Park sprawling across a cleared valley below them. The mobile home sat in neat rows connected by gravel roads that would have seemed peaceful under normal circumstances. But today, the park buzzed with law enforcement activity that had nothing to do with protecting residents. 4 police vehicles formed a loose perimeter around the trailer park's main entrance, while Detective Kane's sedan occupied the small parking area near the community mailboxes. The more concerning was the black van positioned behind the park's laundry facility, hidden from casual observation but perfectly positioned for rapid deployment. "Professional setup," Celia observed, studying the tactical arrangement through military-grade optics. Perimeter control, command coordination, and quick reaction capability. Someone with serious training planned this. Sarah focused on individual trailers, looking for signs of Jenny's patrol car or any indication of where Tommy might be located. The park housed approximately 60 families, most of them working-class people who minded their own business and expected law enforcement to do the same. "There," Sarah said, pointing to a trailer near the park's rear boundary. "Jenny's car is behind that blue, double-wide, hidden from the main road." The positioning suggested Jenny had recognized the danger and taken defensive measures, but it also meant she was trapped with limited escape routes. The trailer sat at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by open ground that would expose anyone attempting to reach or leave it. "Movement by the van," Celia reported. 2 figures in tactical gear emerged from the black vehicle, moving with the coordinated precision of special operations personnel. They weren't local criminals or corrupt police officers. They were professional soldiers working for whoever controlled Morrison's criminal network. Military contractors, Celia said grimly. Probably former special forces, now working private security for drug cartels. They'll have better training and equipment than local police. The presence of professional killers elevated the threat level beyond anything Sarah had encountered during her police training. These weren't desperate criminals acting impulsively. They were calculated operators following a systematic plan to eliminate witnesses. Sarah's radio crackled with Investigator Park's voice. Federal agents are being delayed indefinitely at roadblocks. State police helicopters have been diverted to respond to an officer-down call in neighboring county. You're on your own until we can break through Morrison's containment. The message confirmed their worst fears. Morrison wasn't just blocking federal intervention. He was actively misdirecting resources to prevent any interference with his cleanup operation. The fake emergency call would tie up state police assets for crucial hours while he eliminated threats to his network. How many innocents in that trailer park? Celia asked, thinking beyond the immediate tactical situation. Sarah realized the scope of potential collateral damage Morrison was willing to accept. 60 families, including children and elderly residents, were trapped inside a perimeter where professional killers were preparing to operate with military weapons. He'll sacrifice the entire community to protect his operation, Sarah said with growing horror. Not if we stop him first, Celia replied, already planning their approach through terrain that offered concealment but limited mobility. They began their descent toward Pine Ridge, moving in bounds that kept them hidden while closing distance to effective combat range. Celia's military training was evident in every movement, while Sarah adapted quickly to tactics she'd never encountered during police academy instruction. The trail ended at a chain-link fence that marked the park's rear boundary, beyond which lay 50 yards of open ground before reaching the nearest trailers. Crossing that space meant exposure to observation and fire from multiple directions, but remaining hidden meant abandoning Ginny and Tommy to certain death. Suppression and maneuver, Celia said, checking her weapon's action one final time. I provide covering fire from this position while you advance to the trailer. Once you're in position, you cover my movement to join you. Sarah understood the plan's logic, but she also recognized its desperate nature. There were two people with limited ammunition facing unknown numbers of professionally trained opponents who controlled the terrain and had superior firepower. What about civilians? Sarah asked. Warn them to stay inside and get down, Celia replied. But our primary mission is extracting Jenny and Tommy before the kill order comes down. A gunshot echoed across the trailer park, sharp and unmistakable in the morning air. Sarah's blood froze as she realized the sound had come from the direction of Jenny's hidden patrol car. Contact, Celia said tersely, raising her rifle and scanning for targets through the scope. Through binoculars, Sarah could see movement near the blue double-wide where Jenny had taken cover. One of the tactical team members was advancing on the trailer while his partner provided overwatch from a concealed position. Another gunshot rang out, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of return fire from a police-issue sidearm. Jenny was alive and fighting, but she was outnumbered and outgunned by opponents who could afford to take time establishing perfect firing positions. We go now, Celia said, cutting through the fence with wire cutters that Father Santos had included in their equipment package. Sarah followed Celia through the gap and immediately began the exposed sprint toward the trailer park's rear section. Her police training emphasized cover and concealment, but military tactics sometimes required accepting risk to achieve mission objectives. Halfway across the open ground, a voice shouted from their left flank, "Armed suspects approaching from the west!" Detective Kane had spotted their movement and was coordinating a response that would trap them in a crossfire between the tactical team and local police units. Sarah realized they'd lost the element of surprise, but they'd gained something equally valuable. Morrison's forces now had to divide their attention between multiple threats. Celia dropped to prone position and began placing accurate rifle fire on Kane's location, forcing the detective to seek better cover while Sarah continued her advance toward the trailers. The suppression worked exactly as planned, disrupting enemy coordination while allowing friendly movement. Sarah reached the first trailer and immediately began working her way toward Jenny's position, using mobile homes as cover while avoiding windows where frightened residents might be watching the unfolding firefight. Each bound brought her closer to the blue double-wide, but also deeper into Morrison's kill zone. "Police, stay inside and get down!" Sarah shouted to anyone who might be listening, hoping to prevent civilian casualties while maintaining movement toward her objective. A burst of automatic fire erupted from the direction of the black van, followed by the sound of metal striking metal as bullets impacted trailer walls. The professional killers had joined the fight with weapons that outclassed anything local police carried. Sarah dove for cover behind a small storage shed as high-velocity rounds chewed through aluminum siding just inches from her position. The professional team wasn't just trying to kill her. They were demonstrating overwhelming firepower to break her will to fight. But Celia's return fire was immediate and devastating. Her military marksmanship training was evident in the precision of her shots, forcing the tactical team to seek better cover while giving Sarah opportunity to continue her advance. "Jenny!" Sarah called as she reached the blue double-wide. "It's Sarah Blake!" "Back here!" Jenny's voice came from behind the trailer, strained but strong. "Tommy's hit, but he's alive!" Sarah rounded the trailer's corner to find Jenny crouched behind her patrol car, with Tommy Brewster bleeding from a shoulder wound. The young man's face was pale with shock, but his eyes were alert and focused. "How bad?" Sarah asked, quickly assessing Tommy's injury while scanning for immediate threats. "Through and through," Jenny replied. "Bleeding's controlled, but he needs medical attention soon." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Celia was maintaining suppressive fire from her position at the fence line, but ammunition was limited, and enemy forces were maneuvering to flank her location. They needed extraction immediately, but the route back to the forest was now covered by multiple firing positions. "Vehicle approach," Tommy said weakly, pointing toward the park's main entrance. Sarah looked up to see additional police units arriving, expanding Morrison's forces just as their situation became most desperate. But something was wrong with the new arrivals. They weren't deploying tactically or coordinating with existing units. Through binoculars, Sarah recognized Captain Rodriguez behind the wheel of the lead vehicle, his face grim with determination rather than confusion. The cavalry wasn't Morrison's reinforcements. It was honest cops who'd finally realized their department had been compromised. "Rodriguez!" Sarah shouted across the distance, separating them. "Morrison's running a criminal network. We have evidence!" Rodriguez's response was immediate and decisive. Instead of joining Morrison's perimeter, he began positioning his units to contain the tactical team that had been operating without proper authorization or identification. The firefight's dynamics shifted completely as Morrison's corrupt forces found themselves caught between federal investigation, honest police officers, and military-trained opposition that refused to be intimidated by superior numbers. In the distance, helicopter rotors announced the arrival of state police air support that had finally broken through Morrison's misdirection. The containment perimeter that was supposed to protect Morrison's cleanup operation had become a trap that exposed his criminal network to exactly the kind of scrutiny he'd been trying to prevent. "Move to extraction," Celia's voice came through Sarah's radio. "I'll provide covering fire." Sarah helped Tommy to his feet while Ginny gathered equipment from her patrol car. The three of them began moving toward Rodriguez's position, using the confusion created by Morrison's collapsing operation as cover for their withdrawal from the kill zone. Behind them, the professional killers were attempting to disengage from a tactical situation that had turned completely against them. But Celia's precise rifle fire and Rodriguez's positioning had eliminated their escape routes, trapping them exactly as they'd planned to trap their intended victims. The ghost had become the hunter, and Morrison's criminal empire was finally facing the justice it had been avoiding through violence and corruption. The Pine Ridge Trailer Park had become a crime scene that stretched across multiple jurisdictions, with federal agents, state police, and honest local officers working to sort legitimate law enforcement from Morrison's criminal operation. Captain Rodriguez coordinated the complex effort from a command post established in the park's community center, his weathered face reflecting both relief and disgust at what they'd uncovered. Tommy Brewster sat in the back of an ambulance while paramedics treated his shoulder wound, but his attention was focused on the federal agents documenting his testimony about Morrison's drug distribution network. Despite his pain and shock, Tommy's voice was steady as he described months of coercion that had turned him from occasional user to unwilling participant in organized crime. He said it was just delivering packages. Tommy explained to Agent Rebecca Martinez, who'd arrived with the FBI task force that had finally broken through Morrison's roadblocks. Told me it was police evidence being transferred between departments. I believed him because he was the chief. Sarah watched from nearby, understanding how Morrison had weaponized trust to manipulate vulnerable people like Tommy. The young man's cooperation with investigators was brave, but it also put him at continued risk from criminal associates who'd invested millions in maintaining their network security. Celia emerged from the trailer park's office building, where she'd been providing tactical intelligence to federal agents coordinating the arrests of Morrison's accomplices. Her military bearing was evident as she briefed senior investigators on the criminal network's operational structure. The van crew attempted to exfiltrate through the state forest, Celia reported to Agent Martinez. State police intercepted them at the Logging Road Junction. 2 in custody, 1 wounded, all carrying identification linking them to private military contractors based in Delaware. The professional killer's capture provided crucial evidence connecting Morrison's local operation to interstate criminal organizations. Their employment records would reveal financial networks and criminal associations that extended far beyond rural Pennsylvania. Detective Kane's arrest had been dramatic and public, with federal agents taking him into custody at the trailer park entrance while dozens of residents watched from their windows. His attempt to destroy evidence using his police radio had been futile. Federal monitoring had been recording all law enforcement communications since dawn. "Where's Morrison?" Sarah asked Rodriguez, who was coordinating with multiple agencies while maintaining operational security. "Barricaded in his office at the police station," Rodriguez replied grimly. "Claims he's responding to a federal invasion of local law enforcement. He's got 2 officers with him, but we're not sure if they're loyal or hostages." The standoff represented Morrison's last desperate attempt to control the narrative of his downfall. By positioning himself as a local official resisting federal overreach, he hoped to generate political support that might complicate prosecution efforts. Agent Martinez finished documenting Tommy's initial statement and approached Sarah with the focused attention of someone building a complex criminal case. "We need your complete testimony about the investigation that led to this," she said. "Everything from the first missing evidence reports to last night's surveillance operation." Sarah spent the next hour providing detailed chronology of her investigation, supported by documentation she'd gathered over weeks of careful research. The federal agents were particularly interested in the financial irregularities that Patricia O'Brien had discovered through her parallel investigation. "Councilwoman O'Brien's budget analysis provides the financial framework we need to trace money laundering operations," Agent Martinez explained. "Combined with your evidence documentation and the surveillance video, we can demonstrate systematic criminal enterprise spanning multiple years." Ginny Walsh sat quietly in Rodriguez's patrol car, still processing the psychological trauma of discovering that her own police department had been compromised by the criminals she'd sworn to fight. Her transformation from unwitting accomplice to active resistance had saved lives, but it had also shattered her faith in institutional authority. "What happens to the honest officers?" Ginny asked Rodriguez when he checked on her condition. "Complete review of every case, every arrest, every piece of evidence processed through the department," Rodriguez replied. "Some cases will be dismissed, others will face appeals, and everyone involved will face scrutiny. The systemic damage caused by Morrison's corruption would take years to repair. Public trust in law enforcement had been violated, criminal cases would be overturned, and victims would question whether justice had been served properly." Father Santos arrived at Pine Ridge in his parish van, bringing coffee and sandwiches for investigators who'd been working since dawn. But more importantly, he brought news about community reaction to the morning's dramatic events. Word spreading fast, Santos told Sarah as she accepted a cup of his excellent coffee. "People are scared, angry, but also hopeful that the truth is finally coming out." The community's response would be crucial for rebuilding trust in legitimate law enforcement. Morrison's criminal network had infected more than just police operations. It had damaged the social fabric that connected citizens to their government. Eddie arrived at the trailer park moving faster than his prosthetic leg normally allowed, his weathered face showing unusual urgency despite the successful resolution of the immediate crisis. "Problem at the police station," Eddie reported breathlessly. "Morrison's threatening to release inmates from holding cells unless federal agents withdraw from town." The threat represented a new level of desperation from Morrison, who was essentially taking hostages to prevent his own arrest. The police station housed 6 prisoners awaiting transport to county facilities, including 2 who'd been arrested for violent crimes. "How many officers are with him?" Rodriguez asked. 3 visible through windows, Eddie replied. But I recognized Sergeant Thompson and Officer Martinez. They're good cops who wouldn't knowingly support criminal activity. This information suggested Morrison was using loyal officers as human shields, exploiting their dedication to duty while putting them in danger from federal agents who might be forced to use tactical measures to resolve the standoff. Agent Martinez was already coordinating with tactical specialists who'd arrived with the federal task force. Negotiation first, she decided. Morrison's desperate, but he's also intelligent enough to understand that hostage-taking only makes his situation worse. Celia studied the tactical situation with professional interest. He's buying time for something, she said. Destroying evidence, contacting criminal associates, or arranging an escape route we haven't anticipated. The observation reminded everyone that Morrison had spent months planning criminal operations with military precision. His current desperation didn't mean he lacked contingency plans for exactly this kind of law enforcement response. Dr. Helen Vasquez arrived from the VA Medical Center, summoned by Father Santos to provide psychological support for trauma victims among the homeless population who'd witnessed the morning's violence. But her presence also provided an opportunity to address Celia's long-term medical needs. "You've been living rough for 18 months, Dr. Vasquez said gently as she examined cuts and bruises Celia had sustained during the firefight. PTSD symptoms, inadequate nutrition, exposure injuries. We need to address these comprehensively." Celia accepted the medical attention reluctantly, still focused on the tactical situation rather than her personal health. But Sarah noticed how the veteran's hands trembled slightly when she wasn't actively engaged in mission-critical activities. "What about housing?" Sarah asked Dr. Vasquez. Celia's information and cooperation made this entire operation possible. Federal witness assistance programs provide temporary housing and support services, Agent Martinez said, overhearing the conversation. But long-term solutions require coordination with VA benefits and local housing authorities. The bureaucratic complexity of helping a homeless veteran who'd risked everything to expose corruption reflected broader systemic failures that had created the problem in the first place. Celia had served her country, documented criminal activity, and saved lives. But she still faced uncertainty about basic housing and medical care. Patricia O'Brien arrived at Pine Ridge in her official county vehicle, accompanied by reporters from 3 regional newspapers who'd been following her investigation into municipal financial irregularities. The media presence would ensure public accountability for the criminal network's exposure. "This validates everything we suspected about corruption in rural law enforcement," O'Brien told reporters, careful to credit federal investigators while emphasizing the community cooperation that had made arrests possible. Sarah realized that O'Brien was already thinking strategically about political reforms needed to prevent future corruption. The councilwoman's long-term perspective would be crucial for rebuilding institutional integrity after Morrison's criminal network was completely dismantled. Agent Martinez received an update through her secure communication device that changed her expression completely. "Morrison's released the prisoners," she announced. "But instead of fleeing, they're approaching the station with apparent intent to assist him." The development transformed the standoff from hostage situation to potential armed insurrection. Morrison had cultivated relationships with local criminals who might view federal law enforcement as a common enemy worth fighting. "Tactical teams are moving to secure the perimeter," Agent Martinez continued, "but we need local knowledge to predict Morrison's next move." Celia was already studying maps of downtown Misty Hollow, applying military analysis to urban terrain she'd observed for months as a homeless survivor. Her unique perspective combined tactical training with intimate knowledge of the town's forgotten spaces. "Underground tunnels," Celia said, pointing to infrastructure maps that dated to the coal mining era. "Most people have forgotten they exist, but they connect multiple buildings, including the police station." The tunnel system provided Morrison with escape routes that federal agents hadn't anticipated or secured. His apparent willingness to make a final stand might actually be preparation for disappearing through infrastructure that only longtime residents would remember. "We need teams at every tunnel exit," Agent Martinez said, already coordinating expanded containment efforts. But Sarah realized Morrison's desperation went beyond simple escape planning. A man who'd built a criminal empire worth millions wouldn't surrender everything without attempting to protect assets that remained hidden from federal investigation. "He's got contingency funds," Sarah said suddenly, "money and evidence hidden somewhere that federal agents haven't found yet. The race against time had entered its final phase, with Morrison's capture imminent but his criminal empire's complete destruction still uncertain. Outside the police station, federal agents were preparing for a confrontation that would determine whether justice prevailed over corruption in Misty Hollow. The underground tunnel beneath Main Street smelled of decades-old coal dust and stagnant water, but to Morrison it represented his last hope for escaping federal justice. He moved through the narrow passage with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd planned this contingency for months, carrying a waterproof bag containing cash and documents that could buy him sanctuary in countries without extradition treaties. Above ground, federal agents coordinated the largest law enforcement operation in Misty Hollow's history, but they were searching for a man who'd already disappeared into infrastructure that predated their tactical planning. Morrison's knowledge of the town's forgotten spaces gave him advantages that military training couldn't anticipate. Celia stood in the police station's lobby, studying building blueprints while Agent Martinez coordinated teams at potential tunnel exits throughout downtown. The veteran's military intelligence background was crucial for understanding how Morrison might navigate through underground passages that connected businesses, municipal buildings, and private residences. "Here," Celia said, pointing to a junction where 3 tunnels intersected beneath the old bank building. Natural choke point where he'd have to make directional choices. If we position teams correctly, we can force him toward predetermined exit points. Agent Martinez nodded approvingly. "You're thinking like someone who's conducted urban operations in hostile territory." "Because I have," Celia replied simply. "Afghanistan taught me that local knowledge combined with tactical planning beats superior numbers every time." Sarah arrived at the police station after ensuring Tommy's safe transport to federal protection in Philadelphia. The young man's testimony would be crucial for prosecuting other members of Morrison's network, but his immediate safety required removal from Misty Hollow until trials concluded. "Status on the tunnel search?" Sarah asked. "Morrison's moving toward the old Kowalski building," Agent Martinez replied. "Teams are converging, but he's got a 20-minute head start through terrain he knows better than we do." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Morrison was fleeing toward the same abandoned auto repair shop where Celia had been providing intelligence that ultimately exposed his criminal empire. The building that had sheltered Misty Hollow's forgotten population was about to witness the final confrontation between corruption and justice. Rodriguez emerged from the police station's evidence room, carrying boxes of documents that Morrison had attempted to destroy before his escape. Financial records, communication logs, personnel files that document the full scope of his network. Rodriguez reported. The recovered evidence painted a devastating picture of systematic corruption that had infected multiple levels of government. Morrison's operation had involved not just drug trafficking, but also money laundering, witness intimidation, and the manipulation of court proceedings through Judge Blackwood's cooperation. "Estimated value of the criminal enterprise?" Agent Martinez asked. "Conservative estimate based on these records?" $15 million over 3 years, Rodriguez replied grimly. "And that's just what we can document. The actual scope was probably much larger." Father Santos appeared in the station doorway, his usually calm demeanor showing strain from the morning's dramatic events. "Community's gathering at the church," he said. "People want to understand what's been happening and they're scared about what comes next." The community's reaction would be crucial for rebuilding trust in legitimate government after Morrison's betrayal. Citizens who'd believed they were protected by law enforcement had discovered that protection was actually predation disguised as public service. "How are they handling the truth?" Sarah asked. "Mixed," Santos replied honestly. "Anger at being deceived, fear about safety, but also relief that someone finally stood up to corruption. People are talking about Celia like she's some kind of folk hero." The description made Celia uncomfortable. She'd spent 18 months trying to remain invisible, and sudden fame felt as threatening as homelessness had been. But Sarah understood that Celia's story represented something powerful for people who felt forgotten by their own government. Eddie arrived at the police station moving with urgent purpose despite his prosthetic leg. "Morrison's cornered in the Kowalski building," he reported. "Federal agents have all exits covered, but he's threatening to set the place on fire rather than surrender." The threat represented Morrison's final attempt to control circumstances he could no longer influence. Destroying the building would eliminate evidence and create a dramatic finale that might generate sympathy for his portrayal as a victim of federal overreach. "Are there civilians in the area?" Agent Martinez asked immediately. "Homeless folks use that building for shelter," Eddie replied. "Most cleared out when the shooting started, but some might still be inside." The possibility of innocent casualties elevated the situation beyond a simple fugitive apprehension. Morrison was using the community's most vulnerable members as human shields, exploiting their invisibility to society in the same way he'd exploited their desperation for his criminal operations. "I know that building better than anyone," Celia said quietly. "Every entrance, every hiding spot, every way in or out." Agent Martinez studied Celia with professional assessment. "You're suggesting what exactly?" "I go in alone," Celia replied. "Talk to him as one veteran to another, maybe convince him to surrender without hurting anyone else." The proposal was dangerous beyond calculation. Morrison had already demonstrated his willingness to kill to protect his operation, and cornered criminals were unpredictable even under the best circumstances. "Too risky," Sarah said immediately. "You've done enough. Let tactical teams handle this." But Celia was already moving toward the station's exit, her decision made with the same instinctive leadership that had kept her squad alive in Afghanistan. "Morrison's not just a criminal," she said. "He's a scared man who made terrible choices and now sees no way out. Sometimes talking works better than tactical assault." Agent Martinez caught up with Celia at the station door. "If you're determined to do this, you wear communications equipment and body armor. And you follow federal protocols for negotiation with armed suspects." "Agreed," Celia said without hesitation. The walk to Kowalski's auto repair shop took them through downtown Misty Hollow, where residents watched from windows and doorways as the largest law enforcement operation in the town's history unfolded. Federal agents had established a perimeter that kept civilians safe while preventing Morrison's escape. Captain Rodriguez coordinated from a command post established in Murphy's Diner, where Dot Fleming provided coffee and sandwiches to officers who'd been working since dawn. The elderly woman's steady demeanor provided calm leadership for a community struggling to process the morning's revelations. "Hard to believe Billy Morrison was running drugs through our town," Dot said to no one in particular. "His mother was such a sweet woman, must be rolling in her grave." The personal dimension of Morrison's betrayal affected longtime residents who remembered him as a young man with ambitions to serve his community. His transformation from idealistic police recruit to criminal kingpin represented failures that went beyond individual choices. Patricia O'Brien arrived at the command post carrying preliminary budget analysis that revealed the full scope of Morrison's financial crimes. "Embezzlement, fraudulent contracts, kickbacks from municipal vendors," she reported. The corruption touched every aspect of city government. The financial damage would require years to repair, but O'Brien was already working on reforms that would prevent future corruption through transparency requirements and oversight mechanisms that Morrison had systematically dismantled. Celia approached the Kowalski building wearing federal communication equipment and body armor, but moving with the confident stride of someone returning home rather than walking into danger. Through broken windows, she could see Morrison positioned behind cover that would protect him from tactical assault, but wouldn't stop rifle fire from experienced marksmen. "Morrison," Celia called clearly, "it's over. Federal agents have all your records, all your associates, all your money. Surrender now and maybe some prosecutor will remember that you were a cop once." Morrison's response came through a shattered window. "Who are you to talk to me about being a cop? You're nobody. Homeless trash that should have died on the streets months ago." The contempt in Morrison's voice revealed everything about how he viewed people like Celia, disposable tools whose suffering was irrelevant to his personal advancement. But his words also revealed the fear of someone who understood that his criminal empire had been destroyed by the very people he dismissed as worthless. "I'm someone who took an oath," Celia replied calmly, "same as you once did, to protect and serve the community, not exploit it for personal gain." Inside the building, Morrison was weighing his rapidly diminishing options. The tunnel system that was supposed to provide escape had been compromised by federal agents who'd learned to think tactically about terrain he'd considered secret. "You destroyed everything," Morrison shouted. "Years of work, millions of dollars, relationships that took decades to build." "I documented crimes," Celia corrected. "Federal agents destroyed your criminal network. There's a difference." Through her communication equipment, Celia could hear Agent Martinez coordinating tactical teams while monitoring the negotiation. Federal protocols required attempted peaceful resolution before employing force, But everyone involved understood that Morrison's desperation made violence increasingly likely. "Last chance," Celia said. "Walk out with your hands visible, surrender to federal agents, and maybe you live long enough to see trial." Morrison's silence stretched for long minutes while he processed the reality of his situation. Outside, federal agents maintained firing positions, while hoping negotiation would prevent the need for tactical assault on a building that might contain innocent civilians. When Morrison finally emerged, he was carrying a white undershirt attached to a broken radio antenna. His hands were visible, his weapon was left inside, and his face reflected the exhaustion of someone who'd run out of fight. Agent Martinez took Morrison into custody with professional efficiency, reading rights that he'd once used to arrest other people who'd broken laws he'd sworn to uphold. The irony was lost on no one present. 3 months later, Celia stood in her new apartment overlooking Riverside Park, watching Rusty chase squirrels through autumn leaves while coffee brewed in a kitchen that belonged to her for the first time in years. Federal witness assistance had provided transitional housing, but VA benefits restored through Dr. Vasquez's advocacy had given her independence. Sarah knocked on the door carrying groceries and newspapers that carried updates about Morrison's trial proceedings. The federal case had expanded to include criminal associates from 3 states, while local trials addressed corruption that had infected multiple levels of government. "Verdict's in," Sarah said, settling at Celia's kitchen table with coffee that was finally as good as what she'd brewed over camping stoves. Morrison got 25 years federal, Judge Blackwood got 15, and Detective Kane turned state's evidence for a reduced sentence. The justice was imperfect but substantial. Morrison's criminal network had been dismantled. Stolen money was being recovered for community restoration projects, and oversight mechanisms were being established to prevent future corruption. Ginny Walsh stopped by later that afternoon wearing the uniform of a Pennsylvania State Police trooper after transferring from local law enforcement. Her experience exposing corruption had made her valuable to internal affairs investigations throughout rural Pennsylvania. "How's the new job?" Celia asked. "Challenging," Jenny replied, "but honest, and I know the difference now." As evening settled over Misty Hollow, the 3 women sat on Celia's small balcony, watching the town lights come on across the valley. They'd fought together against institutional corruption and won, but more importantly, they'd found something none of them had expected: family created through shared struggle and mutual respect. "What's next?" Sarah asked. Celia looked at Rusty, then at her friends, then at the community spread out below them. For the first time in years, the future seemed full of possibilities rather than merely survival. "Whatever comes," Celia said simply, "but we'll face it together." The ghost had found her home, and justice had found its voice in the most unexpected places. In Misty Hollow, people no longer looked through the homeless veterans who walked their streets, because they'd learned that heroes sometimes wore rags instead of badges. And sometimes, the most powerful words in the English language were simply "don't talk, just listen." The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.